येनाक्षरसमाम्नायमधिगम्य महेश्वरात् कृष्णं व्याकरणं प्रोक्तं तस्मै पाणिनये नमः। वाक्यकारं वररुचिं भाष्यकारं पतञ्जलिं पाणिनिं सूत्रकारं च प्रणतोऽस्मि मुनित्रयं नत्वा सरस्वतीं देवीं शुद्धां गुण्यां करोम्यहं पाणिनीयप्रवेशाय लघुसिद्धान्तकौमुदीम्। हलन्त्यम् इत्यस्मिन् सूत्रे अन्योन्याश्रयः। सो तत्र हलन्त्यम् इति सूत्रेण अन्तिमस्य व्यञ्जनस्य इत्संज्ञा भवति। तादृशी इत्संज्ञा भवति चेत् हल् इत्यस्य लकारस्य इत्संज्ञा भवितुम् अर्हति। तादृशी इत्संज्ञा भवति चेत् हयवरट् इत्यस्य हकारेण सह तस्य ग्रहणं कृत्वा व्यञ्जनानां निर्माणं भवति। हल् प्रत्याहारेण व्यञ्जनानां निर्देशः भवति। तादृशः भवति चेत् हलन्त्यं सूत्रस्य निर्माणं सम्भवति। अनेन प्रकारेण अत्र अन्योन्याश्रयः विद्यते। अस्य अन्योन्याश्रयस्य बहूनि समाधानानि सन्ति। तत्र प्रथमं समाधानम् अस्माभिः दृष्टं लकारप्रश्लेषः इति। हल ल अन्त्यम् इति तत्र रकारस्य प्रश्लेषः क्रियते। किमर्थम् अन्ते लकारः न श्रूयते इति चेत् संयोगान्तस्य लोपः इत्यस्य लोपः भवितुम् अर्हति। सो हल प्लस् अन्त्यं हलन्त्यं, परन्तु तत्र लकारः अस्ति, अतः ल इत्यस्य इत्संज्ञा भवति इति उक्त्वा अन्तिमं शिवसूत्रं हल इत्यस्य ल इत्यस्य इत्संज्ञा भवति। एकः एव वर्णः तस्य इत्संज्ञा भवति। तादृशी इत्संज्ञा यदा भवति तदा हयवरट् इत्यस्य हकारेण सह तस्य योजनं कृत्वा हल इति प्रत्याहारस्य सिद्धिः भवति। एकः एव प्रत्याहारः हल। तदनन्तरं हल इति शब्दः हलन्त्यम् इति सूत्रे प्रयुज्यते। सर्वेषामपि व्यञ्जनानाम् इत्संज्ञा भवति। तदनन्तरं पुनः आदिरन्त्येन सहिता इत्यस्य प्रयोगं कृत्वा णकारस्य इत्संज्ञां कृत्वा णकारस्य इत्संज्ञां स्वीकृत्य अण इति प्रत्याहारः, नो चेत् ङकारस्य इत्संज्ञां स्वीकृत्य एङ् इति प्रत्याहारः, चकारस्य इत्संज्ञां स्वीकृत्य अच इति प्रत्याहारः इति सर्वे अन्ये प्रत्याहाराः सिद्ध्यन्ति। So you have to play like a tennis. You have to first look at a bit of halantyam, come to adirantyena sahita, go back to halantyam, come back to adirantyena sahita. In the successive visits to adirantyena sahita, the meaning is same. Antyena itasah adi madhyaganam swasya cha samnya syat. But the halantyam sutram interpretation is different. The first visit only interprets the la bit. The second visit interprets the hala bit. The second was ekashesha, halcha halcha hal. So in the previous class we discussed itaretara dvandvaha bhavitum arhati, but I looked into Udyota. He says samahara dvandva api bhavitum shakyate. So even if you create samahara dvandva, the question of dvivachana and so on doesn't come up. So we define it as samahara dvandva, like pani cha padau cha pani padam, ahishcha nakula cha ahinakulam. We define a samahara dvandva over here. So hal cha hal, hal antyam. The first hal represents the vyanjanas which will be defined later on. The second hal represents the 14th Shiva Sutram. So halaha antyam halantyam, and then the whole thing, as soon as that la becomes itsamnika, the whole thing repeats. So this is ekashesha. The third technique was punaravritti, which is heavily based on ekashesha. Tatra hal ityasya ekasheshah na bhavati, tasya sthane halantyam iti sutrasya ekasheshah kriyate. So you have two repeated halantyam, 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 halantyam cha halantyam cha halantyam. So you create this kind of samasa. So a single halantyam actually represents two different halantyam is what we say, or is what has been proposed by Dikshita. And then one halantyam talks about the 14th Shiva Sutra, other halantyam talks about the Vyanjana, hal pratyahara. So this is heavily inspired by the Ekashesha technique. In fact, this particular technique of Punaravritti is not defined in the Bhashya. The Bhashya only defines the Ekashesha technique of hal and hal getting repeated and then only one remaining. The Bhattoji Dikshita in Siddhanta Kaumudi, he basically extrapolates that technique to apply the same Ekashesha on halantyam instead of hala. Because when you create halcha hal, the problem is that when the samasa is divided, one hal has to undergo with a different samasa and other hal has to undergo a different samasa. So in order to avoid that, he basically creates a duplication of the sutra itself. So these are the three techniques that we studied. Any questions on these techniques?
To see if my understanding is correct. So in everywhere, first by Prashlesha or Ekashesha, we are giving the Lakara 14 Sutra as its sanya, then making a Pratyahara hal and laka adirantena sahita, we are making it as a pratyahara. Is it right?
That is correct. So all these techniques are basically for singling out the last la of the Hala Shiva Sutram and somehow trying to make it as Itsamyaka. Once that la becomes Itsamyaka, all other steps are almost identical. Correct? So all these techniques will exactly do the same thing. They will try to make the la of the 14th Shiva Sutram as Itsamyaka. So the next technique that I want to discuss is very similar to Ekashesha. It is again inspired by Ekashesha. It is not present in the Bhashya. So this technique is not present in the Bhashya. It is present in Prakriya Sarvaswam or some similar grantha. But the reason I'm going to teach this technique is that this technique has been mentioned in Praudhamanorama by Bhattoji Dikshita and he refutes this technique. So understand the background picture. Praudhamanorama, which is the book written by Bhattoji Dikshita himself, was basically written to defend or to elaborate some of his statements from Siddhanta Kaumudi and probably discuss more related to that. So in Siddhanta Kaumudi, he gives this solution of Punaravritti. This solution of Punaravritti is not there in the Bhashya. Bhashya talks about Prashlesha, Bhashya talks about Ekashesha on Hal and Hal, Bhashya talks about a few other things. There were some other books at that time. Those books talked about some different solutions for this particular problem. So when Bhattoji Dikshita taught the Punaravritti solution, as a grammarian, his job was to compare his solution with a bunch of other solutions and to prove that his solution is better than other solutions. Otherwise, nobody will accept his solution. He will do some arguments which you might not agree to or which you might not appreciate. But his job is to do a certain set of arguments which will show that his technique is better than a bunch of others. So he basically quotes a few techniques, he explains these techniques and he points out a mistake in those techniques. So he will quote the technique of Prashlesha and he will point out a mistake in it. He will quote the technique of Ekashesha and he will point out the mistake in it. There is one more technique that he quotes and he points out the mistake in that technique. And then finally, he gives his own technique of Punaravritti. So basically, three techniques have been picked up by Bhattoji Dikshita. All of three have been refuted in Praudhamanorama, and this fourth Punaravritti technique has been presented by him as the final Siddhanta or a final approach. So what are these three techniques that the Bhattoji Dikshita refutes? One was Prashlesha, which we have already seen. Second was Ekashesha, that is also already seen. Ekashesha on Hal and Hal. The third technique that he refutes is picked up, I think, from Prakriya Sarvaswam or Prakriya Kaumudi. I forgot. There is a reference in Praudhamanorama. One of these books. This technique is called Tantra. So the name of the technique is Tantra. So the fourth technique that we are going to learn, the name of the technique is Tantra. Till now, we were using the word Tantra in a general sense as a substitute for a technique itself. So Prashlesha iti Tantram asti, Ekashesha iti Tantram asti. A device was being referred by me as a Tantra. That is also acceptable, but that is like a general Sanskrit usage. It has nothing to do with vyakarana. Like Vruddhi in the language is different than Vruddhi in Vyakarana Shastra. In the same way, the technique is itself called Tantra. Now, what is this technique? This technique says that many times words in the language have two different meanings. For example, if you take Hari, multiple meanings. Hari also means monkey and Hari also means Lord Vishnu and a bunch of other things. So words in the language have multiple meanings and your job is to pick the right meaning in the right context. So you read the Halantyam Sutram whenever you want to read it, and based on the context, you pick the right meaning of that Sutram and you go ahead. So this is what is the background. This is basically what is the idea behind this fourth technique, Tantram. So what he says is that we have the Sutram Halantyam. The Hal word in this Sutram basically means two different things. He says the word Hal has two different meanings. You pick whichever meaning you want at the right context. So we are not doing any kind of avrutti or anything. We are just saying Halantyam Sutram, the Hal component has two meanings. Therefore, the sutra can be interpreted in two different ways and you pick up whichever interpretation you want. Now, the Hal word has two meanings. One of them is obviously the hal pratyahara, the all indicating all the vyanjanas, because that's essentially where we want to go. The second meaning is he takes the word hala and he breaks it as a shashti tatpurusha samasa. Understand this point. Dasharathasya putraha becomes dasharatha putraha. Ramasya granthaha becomes rama granthaha. In the same way, hasya la becomes hala. So he says, I'll take hala and I'll break it as a shashti tatpurusha samasa, hasya la. So we have that word hala, it has two different meanings. Like for example, you know that famous shloka, right? Rameshwara, Prushte Rameshwarasya Arthe. If you take the word Rameshwara, for example, it can be broken down in multiple ways. Ramasya Ishwaraha Rameshwaraha. Ramaha cha asau Ishwaraha cha Rameshwaraha. Ramaha Ishwaraha yasya saha Rameshwaraha. So same word can be broken down in multiple ways. In the same way, he says the word hala can be broken down in two ways. One way is the actual pratyahara starting from hayavarat to hala, so that becomes hal pratyahara. Second is shashti tatpurusha samasa, hasya la is hala. Now what is hasya la? That is a shashti vibhakti present over there. The shashti vibhakti has multiple meanings. There are 100 meanings, 108 meanings given for the shashti vibhakti. The meaning that we will use in this context is samipya, closeness. For example, when you say Bay of Bengal, that of, which is the Shashti Vibhakti, shows closeness. A bay which is closer to the Bengal is Bay of Bengal. In the same way, here we will use the Samipya. Hakarasya samipe vidyamanaha lakaraha. Hal is hasya la, which is hakara samipastha lakaraha. Now, which lakara is next to hakara? It is the hala Shiva Sutram. There is no other lakara next to hakara. So, hala iti chaturdashe Shiva Sutre vidyamanaha lakaraha hakara samipastha lakaraha asti tasya halantyam iti sutrena itsamya bhavati. So, hala antyam is हकार समीपस्थः लकारः यः अन्त्यः अपि अस्ति तस्य इत्संज्ञा भवति. So you cannot take a lakara that is before her, you have to take a lakara that is after her, and it should be close, samipa, it should not be much far away. So hakara samipastha lakaraha, so that represents the la of the hala Shiva Sutram, that gets the itsamya. So again, we have solved a basic problem. Hakara samipastha lakaraha la tasya samnya bhavati. Tasya samnyayam satyam, the same cycle repeats. You take adirantena sahita, pick the top ha, then give the hala pratyahara, go back to halantyam sutram. Now use the second meaning of hala, which is basically the entire pratyahara. All the vyanjanas become itsamnyaka. Thereby you can create all 44 pratyaharas. Clear so far? So we have this solution on the next screen. It is called tantram. So hala and antyam, the word hala is broken down into two meanings. Hala pratyahara is one meaning and hasya laha, hakara samipastha lakaraha is another meaning. So la of the 14th Shiva Sutram is now hakara samipastha, so it becomes ita. All other steps are identical. Copy paste, nothing is changed.
At a time, in any word, you can use only there. A word can have multiple meanings, but at one given point of time, we are according only one meaning to that word, isn't it? Like
That is
if you
very
are
true.
saying hal, hasya laha asti chet, the same hal at that same instant cannot get hal pratyahara meaning.
Correct. So the same hal is not getting the different meaning at the same time. We are revisiting the sutram. In the first visit, we only take hasyala. Then we go to Adirantina Sahita. Then we revisit the sutram. That time we are not saying hasyala. We are saying hala pratyahara. So there are two different instances in time where the same sentence is being reinterpreted in two different ways. There is a Adirantina Sahita sitting between the two interpretations.
Is that even allowed?
I mean, it's up to you, right? See, we are not reinterpreting the same sutram two times simultaneously. You are at a different stage in the understanding when we interpret it for the first time and when we interpret it for the second time. When we interpret it for the first time, we don't know what is hala as a vyanjana mean. So the only way to interpret it is hasyala. The second round, we know the more information that hala can mean a pratyahara, so we use that.
But
So yes.
tasya prayojanam bhashayam asti khalu, like Lokanath ityadi, it is there. Bhashayam tasya prayojanam asti.
Kasya prayojanam asti?
No, using multiple meanings like that aham tu Lokanatha in the same word at the
Correct.
samasa breakup is there.
Correct. No. Samasa breakup is there. So here also we are doing the samasa breakup only, right? Hala, one is basically samasa and other is basically a simple word which doesn't even contain a samasa. So it is even a basic step than what you mentioned. In the tantram, the fourth technique. Isn't it?
He's doing it without using ekashesha. That is why had he used ekashesha
In your
and then said,
example of Lokanatha, where is Ekashesha happening? It is not Lokanatha. It is just Lokanatha. Some people treat it as Lokaha Natha, yes, and some people treat it as Lokanam Natha. Okay, that Subhashita itself says it, that you are also Lokanatha, I am also Lokanatha, you are a different type of Lokanatha, I am a different type of Lokanatha. So in the same way, Hal, different type of Hal in first step, different type of Hal in third step. Okay. At the end of the day, we have to understand that this is all like some kind of mechanism to justify the Halantyam Sutram and get rid of the interdependency somehow, right? So a little bit of hand waving here and there should be taken up because it has been mentioned at different places by different scholars. If there is a significant problem, one can raise. But like, change of perspective is all that we need. The fact that the same sutram, the same word can mean two different things, and we use one thing in one step and another thing is another step, is just a change of perspective. Talking more about that, this is not really different than ekashesha. In ekashesha, you are basically repeating hala antyam, or in dikshitat solution you are repeating halantyam and halantyam. What is happening over here? You are not repeating, but you are giving two different interpretations, which is essentially same as saying you are repeating and you are attributing one interpretation to each. Okay, on a bigger level is almost the same. Whether you replicate the word and give one interpretation to each, or whether you just keep the same word and give two interpretations to each. In Dikshita's solution also, there was no reason of doing a punaravritti. He could have said, I just have a single sutra called Halantyam with two different meanings, and you revisit that sutra at different points in time for different meanings. He does not do it exactly for the argument that you have raised. How can one have a same sutram having multiple meanings, multiple interpretations? So he says, okay, replicate. But replicating also raises equal number of questions. Is it allowed to replicate like this? So it's the same question asked in a different framework. Even in the Ekashesha, you can ask the same question. Are you allowed to repeat the words like this and then break them out into different samasas, one with Shashti and one with Karmadharya and so on? So in summary, if you see, Prashlesha is a very peculiar technique where a la has been introduced. It's very ingenious, one of my favorites, and I think that should be the best technique. That should be the well accepted technique. All other techniques are very similar. Ekashesha is kind of similar. The technique given by Bhattoji Dikshita is kind of similar. And this Tantram is also very much similar. Quite hand waving. So by far, the Lakara Prashlesha is my favorite technique. Because the remaining three are very brilliant, but they are revolve around the same pattern, same thing, same type. Yes.
Sorry, you said that Bhattoji Dikshit had a criticism of the Tantram, so you'll come to that later.
I was hoping not to come to that because this is much, much beyond your Sudha Teeka. I mean, teaching these techniques itself beyond your Sudha Teeka, but still I'm taking liberty and teaching all these things. Now, if I start talking about what criticism Bhattoji Dikshita has, and then what criticism Hari Dikshita has on top of it, and what criticism Nagesha has top of it on
ब्राह्मणस्य
it,
कम्बलः इति
that is very favorite. You have been talking that example again and again. Brahmina. So basically, Bhattoji Dikshita's job is to refute the techniques that he doesn't prescribe to. But then basically, Bhattoji Dikshita says something, then Hari Dikshita says something on the top of it, then Nagesha will say something on the top of it. So it's basically a chain of arguments and counter arguments that one must learn when they want to study some advanced, significantly advanced grammar, like Praudha Manorama or like Shabdaratna or like Pradipodgyota, whatever. We are not doing any of that. We are doing Siddha Sudha Tika. So I want to limit this discussion at certain point in time and not go ahead. Okay, so all these techniques will have some kind of refutations. I'll give you a very simple example. The Lakara Prashlesha technique has a huge problem that Bhattoji Dikshita points out. The first technique, Lakara Prashlesha, has a huge problem that Bhattoji Dikshita points out. You all have studied that. Can you think of it? Everybody of you has studied it. Nothing new. You have already studied that concept. And in the first Laghu Siddhanta Kaumudi course, when you were studying basic sandhis, you have already studied that concept, and Dikshita points it out as a problem in the Lakara Prashlesha technique. He says that if you have hal plus la plus antyam, it is not possible for the Lakara to undergo a lopa. Why? He says Sanyoganta Silopa cannot be applied. Why?
It is not the antya.
It is not antya.
It is not the end of the padam. Is that right?
Hal plus la is the end of the padam. Hal cha la cha hal.
Sutra is halantyam.
So halantyam is padadvayam. Hal plus antyam, two padas.
Yeah, but there is a samhita by default in it. It is not without this thing.
So what has Samhita do? All that we are saying is Sanyogantam yat padam tadantasya antyasya lopaha bhavati.
It
Samhita
is
is
not
not
the
coming in
end
the
of the
picture.
padam. It is not the end of the padam then.
No,
How
no.
is it not end of the padam? I'm
It is
telling you
the
na,
end of
hal is one pada, 1 second. Hal is one pada, antyam is one pada. When you say Ramo gacchati, or let's say simple one, api atra, api is one pada, atra is one pada. Whether you do sandhi or whether you don't do sandhi, padas don't change. The concept of pada is suptingantam padam. It has nothing to do with sandhis. So hal plus la is actually a pada.
Basically, even though it may be the end of the padam, tatra avasana nasti. So,
Arey, where is the question of avasana in sanyogantasya lopaha? Does it say that there has to be avasana over there? Do you want to go to sanyogantasya lopaha and see what it says?
यणः प्रतिषेधो वाच्यः
It was just where it was there on the screen. Yasya padasya ante sanyogaha vidyate tasya padasya antima varnasya lopaha bhavati. And now recollect your Sudhyupasyaha. You learnt a Vartika called Yanaf Pratishedho Vachyaha. Sudhi plus Upasyaha, E becomes Ya, and then that Sudhya was a Pada, and then Ya was forced to go away by Sanyogantasya Lopaha, and he says, gives a Vartika called Yanaf Pratishedho Vachyaha. So Yana letter cannot be removed by Sanyogantasya Lopaha. Clear? And therefore, when you have hala plus la, is la a yana letter? Yes. So by yana pratishedho vachyaha, you cannot get rid of the la at the end of hala plus la by sanyoganta silopaha is an argument that is presented by Bhattoji Dikshita in Praudha Manorama to refute the solution of Lakara Prashlesha. Everybody with me so far?
yeah.
Yanaf Pratishedho Vachyaha. Okay, don't forget things that you have learned. The irony over here is that Yanaf Pratishedho Vachyaha Vartikam has itself been refuted by Bhashyakara. Bhashyakara says this is not a Vartika that should be there in the system. Get rid of this Vartika. Okay, so when you take that argument in the picture, Bhattoji Dikshita's argument collapses. Now this actually raises more questions in your mind. If Yanaf Pratishedha Vachya has to be removed, then how do you justify the case of the Dhyatra and so on? How can Ya not be removed? There are answers to it, very beautiful answers to it. Let's not go in those details because that's too much digression. But the point is, Bhattoji Dikshita presents an argument of Yanaf Pratishedho Vachyaha to say la cannot be removed. The solution actually, or the counter argument over there, is that the Bhashyakara does not agree Yanaf Pratishedho Vachya as a Vartikam. That has been refuted by the Bhashyakara. And if there is no Yanaf Pratishedha Vachyaha Vartikam, then how can one have Yanaf Pratishedho Vachyaha blocking the lopa of la? Clear? So there are arguments in Praudha Manorama which can be refuted. Now Bhattoji Dikshita doesn't talk about this because his job is to show the other arguments are wrong. These people have also need to play politically correct. They need to show their argument is right and other arguments are wrong. So he is going to show faults in other arguments. He does not go till the end and say that that argument, that fault is itself wrong or anything like that. Okay, so but anyway, so basically he refutes each argument one by one. We will not go in the details because that's too much of digression for our course. I would like to finish the Halantyam Sutram today and move on to the next Sutram in the next class. So we saw 4 techniques till now. The first Lakara Prashlesha was given in the Bhashya. The second Ekashesha is given in the Bhashya. The third Avrutti is given by Bhattoji Dikshita. It is not referenced in the Bhashya, but it is heavily dependent on Ekashesha. The fourth technique, Tantram, is also not in the Bhashya, but it is again heavily dependent on Ekashesha. So in this way, we have seen 4 techniques. Only 2 of them are in Bhashya, 2 of them are not in Bhashya. Which means there are 2 more techniques present in the Bhashya which you have not yet looked up. So the next 2 techniques that are present in the Bhashya are actually Ekadeshi Ukti. Ekadeshi Ukti is a technique that is only a one-sided argument. It is not a completely valid argument. It is usually something proposed by a student and then just gets recorded in the system. So like for example, we are having a discussion, I ask you a question, people come up with their own solutions. They are not necessarily correct, but they get recorded. In the same way, these kind of arguments are the solutions that are proposed by the students. They have some fault in them. For some of you the fault might be obvious, for some of you it might not be obvious, but there is a fault in them. So they are not to be taken as Siddhanta, but nevertheless they are present in the Bhashya. So we take a quick look at them because we have already spent so much time learning the first 4. Let's learn next 2, which is like in 5, 10 minutes. So the next technique over there is, let's see. So here he says, Rukarasya eva idam gunabhutasya grahanam. So this is the 5th technique that we are going to talk about it. Rukarasya eva idam gunabhutasya grahanam. Actually very simple concept. Tava plus Lrukaraha becomes Tavalkaraha. We all know this guna sandhi. So a plus lu swara becomes al. In the same way, he says that the 14th Shiva Sutram hala is actually ha plus lu. Lukaraha asti tatra. Ha plus lu becomes hala. Like tava plus lukaraha becomes tavalkaraha. Ha plus lu becomes hala. So we are going to do a guna ekadesha and we are going to say ha plus lu is actually hala. When we do that, by doing the antadivaccha, by doing the antavad bhava, this la is now originally lu. So this lu now becomes its samyaka by upadeshya janunasikaita because it is an accelerator. How is it anunasika? Pratidnya anunasikyaha paniniyaha. We assume that it is anunasika by the definition. We assume that Panini mentioned it as anunasika. So once it becomes anunasika, upadeshya janunasikaita will make it its samyaka. As soon as it becomes its samyaka, the basic problem is solved. The la has become its samyaka without the anyanyashraya. So you go ahead and repeat the same argument. Combine that la with the adi hakara of hayavarata, create the hal pratyahara. Now all the terminal hal are ita. Come back to adirantyena sahita and make all the pratyaharas.
महोदय अत्र अनुनासिक लकारस्य इत्संज्ञा भवति परन्तु तस्य यण् न भवति खलु
What yad?
नाट् यन् सारी गुणः अत्र अनुनासिकलकारः भवति चेत् गुणः न भवति
आत् अचि गुणः. That's the sutram, right? Ad gunaha achi comes as an anuvritti. So ach pratyahara will include all the bhedas, right? All the 18 bhedas of akara. Anunasika, niranunasika, rasva, dirgha, pluta, udatta, anudatta, swarita. All will be included, isn't it? What is the sutram? Ad achi gunaha.
परन्तु तत्र विधीयमानः चेत्
विधीयमानः कः अस्ति? विधीयमानः कः अस्ति? लुकार is not विधीयमान. Lukar is just a component in the sandhi.
Okay, yeah, in lakar
it's a sthani. Yeah.
But in Maheshwara Sutrani, we said, we don't have the vivaksha or we don't have the intention of sandhi anywhere else. So, a, e, u, we did not make sandhi. So, if we just make a sandhi in her, it is totally disturbing the sequence. And the next thing is,
right. Absolutely right. I can present the same argument for ra pratyahara. Ra pratyahara cannot exist because it is disturbing the whole argument. It is disturbing the whole sequence. Not even once Panini has created a pratyahara using a swara over there, right? So arguments can always be put forth. So we can say vivaksha nasti atha sandhi na bhavati in first 13 sutras and then have a vivaksha in 14th. You can have whatever explanation you want, right? It is you who decided vivaksha nasti. Maybe Maheshwara did not have vivaksha in first 13 and he had a vivaksha in 14th. How are we to stop that? Right?
That, yeah.
Okay.
But using that sutra only
this
we
technique
create
has a lot of hand waving over here, but you have to understand the technique that is given. Let's actually look at the language. Lukarasya va idam gunabhutasya grahanam tatra upadeshe ajanunasika ita iti itsamnya bhavishyati. That's all that he explains. Lukarasya idam prayojanam upadeshe ajanunasika ita iti itsamnya bhavati.
One question, Mother.
Yes.
Atra idanim tu with this technique, the anunasika lakara becomes it and tasya lopaha bhavati. So how does that translate to the hal the anta hal letter, which is not which is not an anunasika swara becoming it?
Because hal, the l inside hal is considered as a lu swara, and therefore it can go by upadesha ajanunasika.
All right, but then if it's going by upadesha ajanunasika it, then how are we solving the problems for the other so how do we circle back to all the other pratyahara?
Because lu is its visible form is a l, so it becomes itsamnyaka. The l is becoming itsamnyaka, but it is not becoming itsamnyaka by any other sutra. It is becoming itsamnyaka by upadesha ajanunasika. So we are using a different sutram to break the cyclic dependency. We say la is itsamnyaka by upadesha ajanunasika. Now how can la be itsamnyaka by upadesha ajanunasika if it is not a swara at all? So we say la is actually lu in disguise. So we treat it as lu by antadivachya by taking the antavad bhava. So lu becomes itsamnyaka. So la becomes itsamnyaka, and as soon as la becomes itsamnyaka, the same chain of argument as previous follows. That you combine it with the previous ha to create a hala adirantyana sahita makes it a pratyahara. Then go back to halantyam. Now interpret halantyam as hala containing all the vyanjanas and come back to adirantyana sahita.
I see. Okay.
The fundamental problem with this argument, some of you have already pointed out some problems, but the fundamental problem with this argument is that it does not break Anyonyashraya at all. It introduces a new Anyonyashraya because now you are using Upadesha Ajanunasika Ita, and Upadesha Ajanunasika Ita itself has the word Acha, which is being generated by Halantyam. Understand, this is a very crucial point. This is different than Sanyogantasya Lopaha. In Sanyogantasya Lopaha, there is no Anyonyashraya over there because Sanyogantasya Lopa is used for construction of the sutram without treating it as a sutram. Hal plus la, one la being removed, is just like a normal rule being applied on a set of words, or at the end of or on a sanyoga at the end of a word. What is happening over here is in Upadeshaya Janunasika Ita, the interpretation of Upadeshaya Janunasika Ita is required not in the creation of the sutram. Hala Sutra creation does not require Upadeshaya Janunasika Ita. The application of Upadeshaya Janunasika Ita is used in the argument itself. So if Upadeshaya Janunasika Ita is used in the argument itself, Upadeshaya Janunasika Ita depends on Acha depends on Adirantena Sahita, that depends on Halantyam, which is now depending on Upadeshaya Janunasika Ita. So there is an unnecessary cyclic dependency. So you are introducing another problem, another Anyonyashraya before you terminate one Anyonyashraya. So that is actually leading to another problem. We will not discuss this particular solution in details because there is full of problems, but I just wanted to put forth this solution in front of you. Clear? Any parting questions or discussion? Don't argue for or against this particular discussion, this particular solution, because as I mentioned, is full of mistakes. But because Bhashya mentions it, we need to understand the technique that was used. The reason why we need to learn about this is this innovative idea that Hala can be represented as H plus Lu, which I'm sure nobody of you have thought before this class. So Hala itself can be represented as H plus Lu is the idea that we learn from this. The last and the sixth technique, which is absolutely nonsense. Let me start at the onset of it, so don't even argue about that, but it's mentioned in the Bhashya, so let me just make a quick reference. Is that we say, I don't know if there is a slide or not. Yeah, I think there is a slide on that. We say Acharya Pravrittihi. Okay, the Acharya Pravritti says that why would somebody put random letters at the end of Maheshwara Sutras? Ayuna, Ruluka, Ayonga, Ayocha. These letters have absolutely no business over there. The only sensible use of these letters is to make them Itsamyaka. Okay. So basically, Acharya Pravrittihi means that the behavior of Panini tells us that Lo is Itsamyaka. Now, what kind of behavior of Panini? He creates a sutram called Liti. This is the sutram that is referenced in the Mahabhashyam. Liti sutram, it talks about what happens when Lakara is Itsamyaka. Now, if Panini never wanted Lakara as Itsamyaka, he would not have created this sutram. So, the very fact that he created this sutram says that Panini is in favor of making Lakara as Itsamyaka. He creates that Lakara as its samyaka in pratyayas like Navula or Namula or Nalla. So there are various places where he creates Lakara as an Itsamyaka. So terminal Lakara can become Itsamyaka, and that is already approved by Panini. This is called Acharya Pravrittihi. The usage pattern done by Panini dictates this. Therefore, law of Hala is Itsamyaka, and therefore there is no Anyonyashraya at all. Is basically the argument. Now, same argument can be applied for all Shiva Sutras. Therefore, na of Ayuna is Itsamyaka, ka of basically Ruluk is Itsamyaka. So, essentially, there is absolutely no dependency of Halantyam and Adirantena Sahita at all. So, that is exactly what the last part in the Bhashya is all about. So he says, Athava Acharya Pravrittihi Jnapayati Bhavati Lakarasya Itsamya. Lakara is ita, that is given by Panini because he uses the sutram called Liti and creates pratyayas like Nala, or Nala is the pratyaya for lit Lakara. So Nala or Namula or Navula. So these pratyayas are created and they are Itsamyaka, they have an Itsamyaka Lakara. He only talks about Lakara for now. So having an Itsamyaka Lakara in the system is not a big deal. Panini has done it in Ashtadhyayi. He has created a sutram called Liti, so it is like a granted assumption of the system. So let's make Lo as Itsamyaka. No need to worry about Anyonyashraya. Is what the last argument is. Okay. Now I don't know how many of you agree, how many of you don't agree, but forget about it. I mean, this has been presented as one-sided argument, an argument put forth by the student which basically is not even further discussed because it is very naive. Okay,
That's
so
the only
these
one
are
I
the
understood.
okay. Okay, so these are the basic 6 arguments that are presented in the entire Halantyam Sutram and related discussion. None of this is there in Sudha Teeka, but I wanted you to give understand a glimpse of what Vyakarana Shastra is about, so that those of you who want to leave the class can leave and never come back. So, but this is how basically in the Halantyam Sutram we have 6 different ways of dealing with Anyonyashraya. So first is Lakara Prashlesha. This is by far my favorite, and I think this should be the standard solution. Second is Ekashesha. Third is Avrittihi or Punaravrittihi. Fourth is Tantram, which is basically use the word with 2 different meanings. Tantram. These are the 4s that at least make some sense. The 5th and 6th are Ekadeshi Uktis. So 5th is Guna Ekadeshaha. Ha plus Lu becomes Hala. And 6th is Acharya Pravritti. So I think that's where we hopefully complete the discussion of Halantyam. उपदेशे अन्त्यम इति आद्योच्चारण विषयीभूतः यः शब्दः तस्य अन्त्यम हल इत्सम्यकः स्यात् इति फलितः अर्थः आद्योच्चारणम् इत्यस्य अर्थद्वयम् आद्यानाम् उच्चारणं नो चेत् आद्यञ्च तदुच्चारणं प्रथमम् उच्चारणम् इति अर्थः शिवपाणिनि सो वी स्टार्ट विथ शिवपाणिनि प्रभृतीनाम् आद्योच्चारणम् उपदेशः केचित् तु तत्र कारिका अपि दीयते. We saw Upadesha can be understood as a Karana Vyutpatti, as a Bhava Vyutpatti, as a Karma Vyutpatti. All these things have been discussed. This Anyonyashraya part was not there in Laghu Siddhanta Kaumudi or Sudha Teeka, but I just did an extra mile and went and taught you the concept of Anyonyashraya. We will stop here today, and in the next class we will start with Adarshanam Lopaha. I will possibly not go in these kind of details in the upcoming sutras because I think it's becoming too much for people. It probably needs a little bit of maturity in the grammar before these concepts can be understood. Appreciating is different. I don't, I'm not asking that. But even understanding this requires a little bit of in-depth study. So we'll try to avoid these kind of, going into unnecessary details or bhashya or so whatever. Let's stick to Sudha Teeka going ahead, and hopefully we should be able to complete the course in some time.